So good evening. Welcome to the latest in our Drupal Night series. We at BioRaft do this monthly talk on a variety of topics so that we can give back to the Drupal community in a variety of ways. We also try to pick topics and speakers that we find interesting. So it's educational for us. Hopefully it's educational for you, the viewers. Tonight's speaker is Erich Beyrent, who has a wonderful Thanksgiving themed presentation on data migration. And without further ado, Erich.
Thank you, everyone. I'm glad you guys picked up on the fact that this is a Thanksgiving themed presentation. You're never sure what audience you're going to go into, and the joke was going to be lost. So yeah, today we are going to be talking about data migration with the Migrate module. This is me in my Captain Miles Standish cosplay. I've been working with Drupal since 2004. I drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago and found the Kool-Aid was good, and I use it now for fun and for profit. I'm currently employed at Pearson Education in Boston, and there's some helpful links if you need to check me out or not. So our agendas, there's some things that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the prerequisites for getting started with a Drupal migration. We'll talk about some of the concepts behind the Migrate module. We're going to spend a lot of time on implementation and even more time on classes and organization. We'll be talking about execution, but not in the Pilgrim standards of the time. I didn't know this until recently, but Captain Miles Standish was really fond of beheading people for justice or whatnot. So we won't be talking about that kind of execution, but we'll be talking about how to run your migrations. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about performance. And then maybe we'll do some Q&A if there's time, and some of the people in here don't stump me. So I like to start off with story time. Thanksgiving coming up. Most of you are aware of the traditional story of the Pilgrims. In the year 1620, a collection of data left their proprietary database and their content management system in search of a new open ecosystem. The data wanted the freedom to express itself in different ways without having rigid, uniform constraints forced upon it. That's King James. The data also searched for an open, vibrant community. All right. So maybe that's not quite how the story goes, but it does work for a modern reboot of the classic saga. So we're going to talk about some prerequisites here, some things that are really going to help you for that day, and I guarantee you this day will come. Somebody will come up to you, and it'll be a client, it'll be your boss, it'll be somebody, and they'll come up to you and they'll say, we've got this site that's been around, it's 10 years old, we want to migrate it into Drupal. As Drupal begins to get more and more popular, we're seeing more and more migration projects come about, and so this is going to happen to you at some point, and I know some of the people in this room, it's happening to them right now. I've spent the last 2 years doing migration stuff, some really, really gnarly code bases and databases into Drupal. So it really helps to have a good working Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 installation, because you are going to be migrating data into Drupal. If your installation doesn't work, obviously this is a Captain Obvious moment. You've got to have Drupal 7 up and running. You should have a basic understanding of PHP, object-oriented programming. The migration module is a module that interfaces with a series of classes, and all of your migration code is going to be in classes, and so you need to understand basic things like inheritance, methods, constructors, some basic patterns like the template pattern, because they use a lot of abstract classes, interfaces, things like that. An understanding of Drupal modules, hooks, and the API. That's kind of there's going to be like one hook you need to know for, at least for integrating with migration, but you're going to be using the Drupal API to migrate your data into the system. And of course, you need to understand how to write SQL queries, and especially using the Drupal query interface. So I'm only going to talk about planning very briefly here, because we could spend an entire hour talking about planning. But before you begin a migration project, it helps to identify who the stakeholders are, who owns the data, who enters the data, who manages those people, and so on and so forth. Taking an inventory of the content and the assets that you're going to be migrating. Sometimes it helps to have interviews with content editors and the asset owners, so you understand their workflow, you understand their pain points, so that you can address those, because it's not just about data migration, obviously, it's about the whole interface. And then you're going to do an analysis of the existing data, and that needs to be a deep understanding of the source data. I just did a migration where the source data was across 3 different systems, and knowing how that data interacts and how it all plays together is really, really critical. You'll get to plan out your data types and your content types, taxonomy, relationships, any custom entities and schema that you need to implement. And then you're going to also need to understand how to keep track of the changes in the source data. Sometimes you get lucky and the source data is just sitting there and it's largely static, and other times you don't get so lucky and it's changing on a regular basis, and so you have to deal with that. So the goals of the Migrate project is that it's, number one, accurate. And so what that means is accurate field mappings, relationships, character sets. All those things have to be accurate. You have to accurately represent the data from the source into the destination. It should be repeatable. You should be able to run through the migration, have it run through all of its steps, and roll it right back again and fix your problems and retest. It should be performant. You should be able to measure the data processing rates, your insertion rates, your file transfer rates, and iterate over that to get them better. And lastly, it should be safe. You should not be affecting the source data during your migration. And if you're lucky, customers will not be impacted. That's kind of a hit or miss, and again, that would be another talk about how to actually not impact other systems. So we're going to talk about some concepts now. I've already said the word source a couple times, and the source is simply the interface to the data that is being migrated. So your sources can be a database, it can be SQL based, it can be CSV files, JSON, XML, or straight off the file system. You could be importing from flat HTML files, or God forbid text files. I've seen that too. Sources in Migrate are what are responsible for providing a list of fields of the data that's going to be imported. And most importantly, sources are responsible for iterating over the data that's going to be imported. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Destinations are responsible for saving the data in Drupal. So source is where you're coming from, destination is where you're coming into. One of the tricky things about Migrate is that destinations typically expect a one-to-one mapping between the source and the destination record. There are ways around that, and it can be kind of tricky when you're talking about rollbacks, but typically it's a one-to-one. And then the glue between the source and the destination is the map, which connects the source to the destination. It keeps track of the destination IDs, so it can translate between the source and the data. It tracks the keys, so that you can do your rollbacks. And it allows for migrations to rerun and update the existing records. You can also use it to delete the records and so on and so forth. But so you got your source, you've got your map, and then you've got your destination. And then we've got the implementation, and that starts with the module. Anybody in here not familiar with writing modules? Okay. So basically, when you write a module for your migration, there's only one hook you need to worry about, and that's hook migrate API. You're going to register your migration classes in your .info file, but for the most part, in your module, that's all you have to worry about. And so in this code here, this is obviously the module.info. Your dependencies are migrated, what other dependencies you've got. and then the list of your files that are part, and that will help Migrate go and auto-load the classes for you. Now, all this code, they say, works on Drupal 6 as well if you've got the auto-load module and I think one others. This is really Drupal 7 specific code. Drupal 8 beta 3 is out, so I've been looking at Migrate in there, and it's a totally different animal. So most of this stuff isn't going to apply to Drupal 8. So just keep in mind, this is for Drupal 7. So let's take a look at what this hook looks like. So obviously you declare your hook with the function. And it starts off by declaring this $sign API array. And the API version currently is 2. So those of you who are familiar with interacting with context or views, you'll recognize this sort of notation. And I probably should have warned you before I started the presentation. I'm going to use the C word a lot in this, and by that I mean code. This is going to be a code-heavy dive into Migrate, and so I'm sorry if it's going to be kind of dry. So the next thing, Migrate allows you to split up your migration into groups. And so that's just a way of importing batches of related data or files or whatever it happens to be. So in this case, let's say that we're importing some newsletter type stuff, just for the source of this demo. So I only really need one group, but it's an array of the group name corresponds to a title, and this allows you to, like I said, run batches of migrations all at once by group. Field handlers. We're going to talk about field handlers in a little bit. Just know that you declare field handlers in your Hook Migrate API. And then you start declaring your actual migrations. And this is what maps the name of a specific migration task to a class name and sticks it in a group. So in this case, I've got a newsletter migration. I have a class called newsletter migrations, which again was auto-loaded by sticking it into the files in my .info file, and it belongs to this group called newsletters. And then I have a sources migration. And then we get into the actual classes. Who in here has object-oriented programming background? Okay, so some of you guys do. It's not that bad when we start off. Fortunately, the patterns that they use are really easy to follow. But for best practices, you'll see a lot of examples online about migration classes, and a lot of them tend to declare a bunch of classes in the same file. Don't do that. It's a nightmare to maintain. It's a nightmare to read. So best practice is to declare each one of your classes in a separate file and make sure you pull those into your .info file. And so migration classes extend the abstract migration class. And so when we talk about abstract classes, an abstract class is a class that has one or more abstract methods. And think of it like a template. And so an abstract method defines a loose framework for what the method should do, and then your child classes will override that and implement the details of that method. There are probably a lot more precise ways to say that. And I'm sure some of you will be like, you could phrase that differently. But your base migration class will extend the migration class, okay? And the migration class extends the migration base class, which is provided by the Migrate module. And then that extends another class. And so there's all these classes, and basically they set up shared functionality that all of your migrations are going to use. And they do this so that you don't have to keep repeating your code. It enforces the dry principle, don't repeat yourself. And so in your abstract base migration class, you're going to set up, you're always going to call it the constructor, okay? All of your classes have a constructor. And the first thing you always want to do is you want to call the parent constructor, and that's so that all the other stuff. It's like if you think about Drupal hooks, they call it Drupal hook invoke hook, and it goes and does something in the module, and then it goes and it invokes all the other hooks, right? And so classes, when you're overriding the constructor, you want all the parent classes to do their bit too. Otherwise, you're going to miss parts of the setup. And so that's important that you always call the parent constructor. So Migrate comes with this Migrate UI type thing, which is really useful if you've got clients who want to see what the status of the migration is, they want to follow along, they want to be involved. Think of it as kind of like documentations for them. So you can declare team members who are working on this, and then it'll show up in the user interface. This is optional, you don't need to put this in there, but the Migrate module does support that. This issue pattern here, it allows you to set up a way of doing your migrations and mapping them to issues in a defect tracking. So if you're using Redmine or you're using Jira or whatever, you can actually link your migration tasks into that defect tracking so you can track the status. If you've got a question, does this field need to be migrated? You can then track that, or somebody can track that. You know, if you've got a project manager who's following along, they can track that. Okay, this is the source, and I can go follow what's going on with this field. Now, if you are sharing a source configuration like a database, you could declare that in your base migration, so you don't have to keep declaring that in all of your other migration classes, and it saves you trouble. And so again, a migration class, this is a very basic skeleton. For a lot of migrations, this is really all you need. You start off with your constructor. You have a prepare method that you can call. You have a prepare row method that you can call, and a complete method. So in taking a look at this, again, we have a class called newsletters migration. It's extending that abstract base migration class that we just looked at here. So again, like I said, you do want to call the parent constructor, and then you're going to set up some things here. And what's really important here is this track changes. This is a new feature of the 2.6 release of Migrate. And so if this is enabled, what it does is it creates a hash value for each row of your source data. And then it compares it against the other hashes that it's already stored. And if they're not equal, then it knows, okay, I've got to go and update this instead of create a new record. The old way you used timestamps and high water marks for tracking changes. This is a lot better. So that's a nice addition.
So you basically can go ahead and do your same import with just a couple of differences, and it will only update those differences.
Correct. And you can, there are Drush commands for that, or you could do it in the Migrate admin interface, and I'll show you guys that a little bit later. So now we're talking about the source field. So source fields is in this case we're passing it to. There's a lot going on here. So we'll start off with some source fields. I'm declaring an array of source fields where the key matches the source name in the source database, and then it's got some label. I've set up a connection, database connection in my settings.file, so that goes for some database that I'm connecting to. And I'm setting up this query. So it's a select query, so I'm saying from table profile, grab me all of the fields ordered by the email. And then again, I do a count query. For some reason, you can't clone the select query. That doesn't work, and so I had to go and define it all over again. And then I pass those source fields into my query definition. Again, dry, don't repeat yourself as much as possible. So what we have here is this source equals new migrate source SQL. This migrate source SQL is the thing that goes into your source database, and it's like we talked about, sources are responsible for defining the fields, they're responsible for iterating over the source data. And so then we have destination. So these sources, like I said, there are lots of different types of sources. There's this migrate source SQL, there's migrate source MS SQL, there's source CSV, source JSON, so on and so forth. So when you do this select query and the count query, Migrate uses these things to show you how many total rows of data are going to be imported, and it tells you basically how to get to the data. There is a frustrating difference that I discovered, that if you're migrating from like a MySQL database, and then you look at this and you're like, okay, so I created some database, some select query interfaces here and so forth. I went and did this migration where I had to pull data out of Microsoft SQL, and its source wants query strings instead of objects. And so that took a little bit of time to figure out why this didn't work. So just keep in mind, all the sources are different, and that's a little frustrating. Now we talked about how the sources are responsible for doing the iteration, and if you were to actually take a look at Migrate source SQL, you'd see that it inherits or it extends the Migrate source class, and the Migrate source class implements the iterator interface. And so that is a nice way of being able to loop through your rows by saying next and current and key and all those things, as opposed to some of the nastier, things that we typically do with arrays. Iterators are awesome. If you don't use them, you should. Drupal 8 uses iterators a lot.
So the syntax for the various sources can change, but once you've got that set up, they all have the same interface for the rest of the code. So it doesn't matter if once you get the SQL versus the MSQL or CSV or whatever, the rest of your code won't change. The only place that might change is right here.
Exactly. Now your destination, again, there are lots of different types of destinations. In this particular example here, I'm just migrating this stuff into a database table. Okay, so I've defined some schema using hook schema, and it's created the table called subscribers, and that's my destination. But you can migrate into nodes. You can migrate into taxonomy terms. You can migrate into all sorts of different entities, and there's a lot of built-in support, and you can always write your own, which is really cool. If you have custom entities that you're writing, you'd have to define your own destination handlers. So now we talk about the map. The map is what tracks the migration status, allows rollback, and Migrate module needs to remember which source record resulted in the creation of which database object. And it does this by using this this Migrate SQL map. So what this class does is it creates database tables and it maps that data into those tables. And it needs to know what the data types are and their keys. And so we pass in the schema here. So we've got an ID field from our source. It's an integer. This should look just like hook schema stuff for you. And so when you go and set this up, this is how Migrate SQL Map is going to track your source to your destination. And it knows the destination because it's getting that by calling the get key schema off the destination object. So then when you go and execute this Migrate SQL Map, we'll then go and create a map table and a message table for each migration. It will name them by prepending migrate map underscore and migrate map message underscore with the migration machine name, which in this case was newsletters or sources. And so in this particular case, again, it's the same map, but I'm using a destination table instead. In this case, we said that my destination table, I created a specific schema for this. It's some table that's out there. It's not part of the core Drupal stuff. And so there's different ways to set this all up. If you're migrating it into a taxonomy term, you would use the migration destination term get key schema off of that object. So it's kind of repetitive. A lot of these same features are across all the destination objects, and they follow an interface. So if you go and you write your own destination object, you will implement some static method called get key schema, which will then allow the map to read it. Field mappings. So what a field mapping does is it maps a source to a destination. So in this case, we have a basic field mapping at the top. We've got the source field called email. The destination field magically is also named email. But if it was something else, you would declare what it happens to be, and it's got a description. You can get really, really complicated with your field mappings. As you can see here, you can set default values on specific fields. We talked about issue groups and issue numbers, and so this actually goes back to that whole issue pattern thing that we were talking about. So, that's in Jira, that's your issue number, and then that gets mapped in. So when they look at this in the UI, there's a link that they can click that brings them right into Jira, and they can see the details of what's happening here. And then you can set issue priorities, whether this is an emergency, this is a showstopper, or this is just a normal, everything's cool. These are all optional. You don't need to do any of these things. Like I said, you could start with just this basic field mapping and then add stuff in later. There's other things that you can do. Like, for example, this case, we've got a CSV string. You can call this the separator method, and that will automatically explode that into an array for you. Or you can use callbacks, and a callback is anything that goes to call user func, and so that can be a simple function like JSON decode, or stir to lower if you're converting something to normalize your data, or it could actually be a method within your class, and so you would reference it. You would say callback, open parens, and you would say $this, comma, and then your method name. And so that allows you to do special processing on a field-by-field basis.
You could do that even if it was going to go into, say, a node. If you needed to take the data and do something before you threw it into a node, you do it here.
Yes. Yeah, and I have to say that in most of the migrations I've done, this is called an ETL process, extract, transform, load. So the extraction part is what your source class does, and it extracts the data out of the source, iterates over it. This is the transformation part, because rarely is the data clean that you're importing. You've got misspellings, or you've got duplicates. Duplicates are a big problem, and so they've got this great dedupe method that's built in there. So it'll actually look for these sorts of things, and if it finds duplicates, it'll handle it. Yeah, especially when you're dealing with legacy stuff, stuff you've had 10 years of developers working on it with varying degrees of experience, and the data is going to be all messed up, and you just need to normalize it. You guys will be doing this quite a bit, I'm sure. The other thing that you can do is you can set up dependencies on your migrations. And so in this particular case, let's say we've got this field mapping of UID comes from the source, and then that's your destination, and that's the source. Author ID is the source. But you've already migrated the users. You can call the source migration users, and actually it will go and look up for you the new ID that it's already imported. And so you don't have to go off and do a separate query to say, okay, go look for this data over here, because you've already done it, and it'll just inherit it from this.
So if you were going and creating users, for instance, and so they're getting imported, they get new Drupal user IDs, you don't have to go ahead and go build your queries. It's tracking this when it does the first migration of those users and keeps that table around.
It does it, and that's what one of the things that the SQL map table provides. And so it'll go and look up that thing. So for author ID equals 15, it'll go and look, okay, here's the new UID for it. And so this comes in handy, like if you've imported your users, and now you've got articles, and you want to look up the author ID. Okay, I've already done the users, so now go get the new ID for this particular piece of content.
So you don't need to keep their old ID around someplace stored in your new database, because these translation tables will deal with it.
They do it automatically.
And then once you're done, you could basically get rid of it because all your data's been translated.
Correct.
Is there a benefit to generating new UIDs rather than moving, if you were going from like an older Drupal version to a newer one, and you're using Migrate to do that?
That's a great question. I suppose it really depends on your use case. If you care about preserving that ownership, what I typically do is I use UUIDs because UUIDs don't change. If you're not using them, then you might want to look at doing that, and especially if you're doing anything with deployment, where you're taking stuff off of a staging server and sticking it onto production, and you don't want to have to deal with auto increment IDs changing. you can refer to it by its UUID. And so I typically, on this previous slide here, we talked about these callbacks and default values. And so I'll often add a UUID field on my new objects. That's guaranteed to be unique. There's also going to be times when you're going to have source data that you don't need. You'll come across in your query. Maybe you need it to make a decision about other data, but you don't need to import it. And so what you can do is you can add it to this array of unmigrated sources, and basically there isn't a mapping for it, and Migrate will just throw it away instead of trying to use it. And the same thing with unmigrated destinations. There might be fields on your objects, let's say meta tags. Let's say you're importing a bunch of content and it doesn't have meta tags, but your node object has meta tags because you've got the meta tags module enabled. You can skip over that.
Do you have to actually specify those there, or what happens if you left it out?
In the UI, you get warnings. Basically, it says you've got this number of unmigrated destinations and unmigrated sources, and so
it's
We'll tell you which
expected that
ones.
you'll have
yeah,
something.
it'll enumerate for you which ones you forgot, and so that's really helpful to make sure that you've got a complete picture. I didn't accidentally miss this field. I found it helpful because, especially when you're just starting to get used to the source data. I mean, no one's going to look at a piece of source data and instantly intuit exactly what's happening. And so as you're going through and you're working on this stuff, having that interface say, hey, what about this field over here, kind of makes it helpful, I think. We talked a little bit about high water fields. High water fields are used for tracking changes in the source data. If the source data contains a timestamp, and let's say that's set to creation time of each new item, and then it's changed to the update time. So let's say you've got a node and it's got a created flag and it's got an updated flag, and each time you change it, it changes the update. That's your high water. And so as you're importing these things, it tracks that highest one so that it knows that anything that has a date that's less than that, or greater than that rather, has been changed and needs to be updated instead of inserted. Like I said, in 2.6, that hash mechanism is much easier to deal with, and then you don't even have to set this stuff up. But in this case, this is how you would set up a high water. All right, so we talked about the anatomy of the migration class. We talked about the constructor. That's a lot of stuff that happens in the constructor. In an object-oriented world, you typically don't want your constructor doing a lot of stuff. So what I tend to do is I tend to split those things off into separate methods and call them from the constructor, rather than having this big monstrous constructor. Unfortunately, best practices, when you go in and you're looking at source examples online, everybody sticks everything in the kitchen sink in that constructor. And as you get more and more familiar with object-oriented programming, there are better ways to handle that and better ways to deal with that to make it more readable, more maintainable. And as we go into Drupal 8, more testable, because you have to be able to unit test this stuff as well. And when you've got a big honking constructor with a bunch of different things, it becomes very complicated to test. And the other thing I should mention is if you're coding and you're using tools like PHP Mess Detector and PHP CS, they will complain to you. Those tools will complain to you if you exceed a threshold, if you've got too much cyclomatic complexity, you've got too many if statements and switch statements, or you just have too many methods or too many lines. It'll tell you that you need to refactor things. And so those are good things to pay attention to. So the next method we're talking about is the prepare method. And the prepare method is called just before saving the entity. So it's already looked at all the fields. It's already taken each one of those fields that you've done and run its preparations on it, and it's about to save. This is your last chance to modify the entire object before it gets saved. And then its corollary is the complete method, which is called immediately after the entity is saved. And sometimes you may need to do some application-specific blogging, or you need to update some additional tables. As we talked about, the field mappings, the destinations expect a one-to-one mapping of source and destination, but sometimes that's not possible. And so you can use this complete method to go update some other record. So I've got this node here, and it's got some properties, and now I want to go update something else over here right after it got saved. It's really tricky though when you do that sort of thing, because when you try to roll back, it won't pick up that dependency that you just created. And so you'll roll back and those changes won't get rolled back. And so there are methods that you can also invoke, less common methods, where you can do this, before rollback and after rollback type of stuff to do your own cleanup. Prepare row I use a lot more frequently than I do the callbacks and the other things on the individual field mappings, because, as I said, sometimes you need to make a decision about how to transform a field based on another field. And when you're dealing with a row by row transfer or a field by field transformation, you don't have the whole picture. And so, if that's the case, you really want to use this prepare row method. And it's for two things. It's one for doing your stuff on all the fields if you want, doing your transformations, but you can also use this to skip rows. So let's say that this row has a data member, and it's something that you just don't need. You guys have decided we're throwing this out. You simply return false on the method, and then that row will be skipped. And migration will keep track of that. I've migrated 27 rows successfully, and I skipped 5. And so that skip either means that there was an error with it, or you purposely did it. You'll have to check that out. And then you've got the create stub, and so this is called the chicken and the egg problem. So sometimes you'll have an object that you're trying to migrate, and it references another object that hasn't been created yet. And so a good example of that is taxonomy. Maybe it'll have a taxonomy term, and then it'll have a parent term, and the parent term hasn't been created yet for whatever reason. And so you can use this create stub to actually go and create objects, and then later go and update them. And so that's kind of what this, you import your taxonomy, then your content, and then you try to reference them all the way through. Versus, okay, I'm just going to start with an article, and this article references a user, so now I'm going to go out and I'm going to import this user, and it's got taxonomy, so now I'm going to go create my taxonomy term. Both of these are perfectly valid ways to do your migration, and it all really depends on your source data and really the performance. Where's the data coming from? I've tried to do this per node migration style before. When I had data coming from all sorts of different sources, and performance is an issue. Sometimes the onion skin is better, because then you have a real good sense, okay, we've migrated this, somebody can go and check this. We migrated all these legacy taxonomy terms into Drupal's taxonomy, and now your project manager and your editors can go and check it, and then they say, yep, everything's great, you're done with that, check that off the list. And then you move on to the next migration. Okay, users are coming across, and so on and so forth. So it's really up to you which method you want to do.
So if you can easily break your data down into pieces, then onion skin makes more sense. If on the other hand, you're sort of migrating wholesale, where you go, we're just going to take it an object at a time, so to speak.
Right.
Than doing it with no migration. But it sounds like there's a lot more work there, because you've got to do custom pieces.
Yeah, and so you do end up having your own reference table, so you can keep track of what's coming in, and it is a lot of work. I won't deny that. And because it's a lot of custom code, you can't contribute it back to the community as easily as, okay, this is how you go and you migrate this sort of entity type. But again, it's really up to the individual process.
Would it be easier to keep track of changed content if you're doing the per node method? Where you could say, oh, this node on my old site has changed, and I've done a preliminary migration. Behind the scenes, like, all right, copy to database, and now it's time to go live. The only thing I'm actually running is the stuff that's changed in the last week.
Well, you can do that with both approaches, depending on how you're tracking those changes. So, for example, nodes, your articles will probably have some kind of a timestamp that will indicate, hey, something's changed in here. And so Migrate will pick that up and say, okay, the last time we migrated this, it had this timestamp, and now it's got this. Oh, we need to go update. And so it will track those things for you. And so I did this migration where they were, in this particular case, they were doing taxonomy terms, and they kept adding new terms, and they kept changing other terms. And I was able to keep running through the migration, and it would just pick up the changes, and they were just small sets of changes, because it was tracking based off that high water field, that high water mark. It's a lot more difficult when you're doing it this way, because you got to track those things yourself. because Migrate doesn't necessarily know about all the pieces that you've done behind the scenes. And so this is an overview of the flow of a migration. So you got your iterator, that's your source. And so it's saying select all this stuff from this table, and then for each one, give me a row. It gets the row and it calls prepare row. And so that's, you can do all of your individual things there. And then it runs through all the field mappings and the field handlers. And then it calls prepare, and then it calls complete. And so that's a basic overview of the flow.
So even if you're doing nodes, it's still prepare row, because that's just the way that they've dealt with it. So it's prepare whatever entity is going to be saved as a line in the new.
Right, and that's always an instance of a standard class that comes in. You know, the very, very simple objects that come in, and so you just look at the properties for each one, and those properties are going to match up with the fields that you've defined. And those fields are matched up again with the fields that you defined. Here's what I'm selecting out of the source. And again, if you don't have to implement any of these methods, I mean, you're probably going to implement a prepare. If you've got to do any kind of transformation, but you don't have to call prepare row, you don't have to call complete, you don't have to call those. The parent will get invoked in those cases. All right, so execution. Best practice, use Drush. Unless you're doing the very basic, most simple migrations, just use Drush. When you use Drush, you don't have to worry about time limits. It's faster because you don't have the overhead of running the batch API. It's more reliable because you don't have to deal with browser failures, and there's less points of failure. The batch API also tends to swallow messages. So it'll be running through a bunch of different things, and you'll hit some error conditions or messaging, and Bash API will just swallow it, and you'll never even see it. The other benefit to using Drush is that you can adjust your PHP memory limit on the fly by specifying that on the command line. And so migrations can consume a lot of memory depending on how much source data you're running. And so this is this link here gives you back some documentation about Drush and running migrations and why you shouldn't use the web interface. To run a single migration, you do Drush migrate import and then the name of your migration, or you can use the shorthand Drush MI. Or you can run all the migrations in a group. Remember how we defined groups earlier? You can specify this -- group, and then it'll go through and run all of those. And Drush also gives you great benchmarking. And this is really important because when we talk about performance, you can get a migration. I had this migration, and the through rates were just abysmal. It was going to take like 10 days to run this migration. And so I was able to go in with a command similar to this, and I was able to track the performance. And because of that, I was actually able to drill down where my performance bottlenecks were, and I was able to adjust my migration to deal with it better. And so we went from 10 days down to a day and a half. And because you're able to do these things, you're also on the command line, you're also able to tie in things like xhprof and see where your code performance problems are. Really, really, really critical. But then you also have performance. Let's say that you're running through this and you say, oh, okay, it takes this long to insert a row into the database. Why is it taking so long to do this? It took me a while to figure this stuff out, but database indexes add a ton of overhead when you're doing a bunch of writes. And so it's, especially when you've got multi-column indexes on a table. An example of that is like the comment module. In its hook schema, it sets up a lot of indexes. So what you do is you drop those indexes before your migration. And then when your migration is complete, you add them back in. And so the API is there, it's db drop index, the name of the table and the name of the index. And then at the end, you do db add index. And so what that looks like in your migration is, so you call this pre-import method, which gets called right before the migration is about to start. Obviously you call the parent method to make sure that it fires off whatever tasks it needs. And we drop the indexes. And again, so this refers to this function down here where I'm doing a db drop index. And then post-import fires immediately after the completion of the migration, and that's where you add your indexes back. And you really want to make sure that you do that because you don't want to have to be debugging performance issues down the line. We're all using InnoDB, I hope. If you're not, then I can't help you. By default, each database transaction is flushed at commit. And so what you really want to do when you're doing a ton of writes, that's a lot of flushing to disk, and that's really slow. And so what you want to do is you want to disable the flush, which will cause MySQL to queue up the commits for you. And so what you can do is then you do a batch write instead. And that makes a huge difference in performance. There's a small risk of losing some data if your server crashes, but if you're doing this stuff on, you're starting on a dead machine, the risk is really, really low, and you don't have to worry about it. You also want to disable the double write and the support XA because that reduces the flushing I/O. And again, it's much better. It'll store things temporarily, queue them up in memory, and then flush them as a group.
So a lot of this tuning sounds like it's bottlenecks are because MySQL, et cetera, is set up to be very fast on reads, and all of this is about writes.
Exactly.
For the most part. So you're wanting to disable all these great things that are there for safety and for read. Like I want to do a search again, so you're not doing any searches. You're just basically going, I'm trying to put data into the system as fast as possible.
Right. I mean, if you think of it like a funnel, and you're trying to pour water into the funnel, only so much water can go in that funnel at a time. And so, what you really want to do is not make a bigger funnel. You want to open up the throat so it can all go down faster. And so these are temporary tuning things. You keep them until your migration is done, and then you fix them. And then there's some other things that you probably want to tune, like your key buffer size and all these other things, like setting your mempool sizes and all that stuff, to keep more of MySQL into memory to make it faster.
Does the timing stuff, well, if you make changes here, you'll see it when you go ahead and do like a drush timing thing, you'll see the differences?
Absolutely. And so you can make iterative changes, make a change, restart the database, go ahead and run your migration again, check the stats, watch the performance. Okay, I did get a benefit. Oh no, I'm slower here, so change that back. So unfortunately, there's no magic bullet here. It's a really, you make small iterative changes. It's the key to doing any kind of database tuning. And then an InnoDB file per table. It's really not about performance, but you're often rebuilding your environment when you're doing these migrations and staging, and you're deleting the tables as well often. And so by storing the tables in separate files, you're kind of reclaiming that disk space back. So it's kind of a good thing to have. Resources, the project page doesn't have anything, but the Migrating Handbook is fantastic. The documentation in there is great. The examples in there are great. Mike Ryan, who really has led this project from the beginning, he's very responsive. He's amazing. I can't speak highly enough about the whole team that's worked on this project. The drush commands are there. How to use stubs, that comes in really handy. And then some performance type stuff. And they have a lot of other great things to handle, special cases of migration, because every migration is different. And you will come up with interesting things, interesting problems that you need to solve. And so we can take questions or answers. I can show you more code. I can show you what some of those stats look like during a migration.
So I've got a question about, and maybe this comes back to the planning piece that we kind of skipped over.
Right. Which
is I've got existing data in this format, and I want to go ahead and I want to migrate it to a set of nodes.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that design do you need to keep in mind for migration? In other words, what drives it? Is it you do your new node and then figure that you're going to massage stuff to migrate, or do you figure the migration and you design your node around what's going to be easier to migrate?
There isn't a clear-cut answer for that, because it really depends on the client and the nature of what they're trying to do here. Sometimes it's a straight migration. Okay, I've got this content type over here, and I want to replicate that over here. Sometimes it's, I've got this content type over here, but I don't like it here. I want to move it over here. I want to add some fields. I want to remove some fields. I want to put different taxonomy on it. And then it's a totally different beast. And so kind of hard to say. Sometimes one drives the other, and sometimes it's a very cooperative process. But that's why it's really important to identify your stakeholders and get involved with the people who work with the content from the very early stages, so that you understand what they're doing, they understand what you're doing, and together you build something that works and they're going to be happy with. Because let's face it, at the end of this, you'll have a bunch of stuff in Drupal, but if they're not happy with how it ended up, then it's kind of a waste. Make sense?
So let's say you have, as is probably often the case, you have many different types of content that you're trying to migrate, and relationships between those that content.
Right.
How easy is it then to say, I'm gonna migrate this piece of content first, which is related to this other one, but I only care about this one right now.
Right.
And then later on, I wanna migrate this one also and set up the relationships.
Yep, and that's excellent. That's an excellent question. So that's where stubs come in, because that's that chicken and the egg. So what you do, you've got this one node that comes down, and you're looking at it in the prepare row method, and you say, oh, okay, this references this other node that doesn't exist now. So I'm going to create a stub. I'm going to use my create stub to create a stub node, which basically just all it has is like the ID of the reference. And then later I'll come back in and I'll look to see if it already exists, and if it does, I'll just update it, and then you're done.
So you have to have done that at the time that you did the first migration. Now
Right.
Suppose you didn't do that. If you then go back and add it into your code later, is it smart enough to detect that and do the right thing?
Probably not. No, you'll have to track those changes yourself in a separate reference table. Okay, this now refers to this ID over here, so it becomes a little bit more difficult at that point. And again, you can also, depending on what the content looks like, say it's a different type of content, you can set up dependent migrations. So this migration over here will deal with this content type, this one will deal with this one, this references this, so I can use this other migration to look up what I've already imported. And so there are a couple different ways to handle that. Yeah, references get tricky.
So it can take 10 days to run a migration. How the heck do you test this locally? Like every single time you're making these iterative changes, trying to figure stuff out, can you say only run a percentage of it?
Yeah.
And then how do you, with these stubs, so if they never get filled because it's in the wrong percentage that you're running?
So you can limit the number of items so you can run it in small batches. At some point, though, you have to run the whole thing. I mean, at some point, you just got to bite the bullet. If you are tracking your stats accurately through this, you can extrapolate basically how much time it's going to take, and then you can communicate that to the rest of the team members and set expectations. That's really critical, because when they come to you and they say, all right, what's the status? And you're like, I've migrated, 1.5 million rows. I still have 8 more million to go, and I think maybe it's going to take this long. Well, they're going to keep nagging you over and over again.
But that's also why you have high watermarks or hashes, etc., so that once you get that first one done, hopefully you can go ahead and just run it again, and it will fix your changes. But that assumes, of course, you get a good one the first time.
Well, so what those high watermarks are really used for is tracking differences between source and destination. So you've migrated over here, but it's changed in the source. And so that's really what that's about. It's not really for tracking performance.
So how does this handle revisioning on a specific node? Is it going to go ahead and try and get the newest one and then import all the old ones? Or is it going to start at the older ones, import the newest ones first, and then track every single one of those changes? Or is it just going to get one of them and start fresh?
So that depends on your source query.
Okay.
It depends on what your requirements are and what your source query is. Maybe your requirement is, I need to bring in this article and all of its revisions.
Okay.
And so in your destination, each time you do it, you're going to say, okay, update, create a new revision. You'll set that flag on the node object.
Okay.
So I know it's complicated. I know there's a lot to it, but if there's anything that you remember from this, remember it's one hook in a module and it's 4 methods.
So you've done your 10-day migration, and some things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
You want to run it again.
Yep.
And use the hash or whatever.
Right.
does that take 10 days for it to figure out that it only is changing 2 things?
No, it actually doesn't. It's fairly quick because it only has one field it's looking at, that high water field or that hash.
So it knows immediately, it doesn't have to check everything.
Right. Well, it still has to go through all the rows, but if you're doing a high water mark, then it's a lot faster because it's only one thing it has to look at, right? It's this date, and everything else compares. So this hash by hash is probably a little bit slower. But when you run it, you pass it an update flag in the interface. There's a checkbox that says update, and it just runs and updates just the ones that it needs to.
So if you're doing nodes, then the high water, you always have one, right? Because it changed.
The high water mark is for the source.
Okay.
Okay.
So if you're coming from Drupal and you add nodes.
So there, if you're coming from Drupal into Drupal, that is something that we haven't talked about. In Drupal 8, they've got this module for doing 6 to 8. Haven't looked at it. Couldn't tell you what it is. I know the project is called IMP. There was another. What was the other module called? It was D2 to D to D or something like that, which allows you to do Drupal to Drupal migrations. None of the migrations I have done have been Drupal to Drupal. They've all been some legacy, Microsoft SQL database that's like 15 years old, or a bunch of CSV files, that kind of stuff.
I think for migrating from an old Drupal site, it might as well be something else, because a lot of times the ways you were storing data back in the day are different than you want to do it now. So
Right.
it's
Even
almost,
just migrating from 5 to 7, the best practice was to just start over instead of doing the migration, because it would break things.
Well, and that's exactly why Drupal 8 took this approach of doing a straight migration rather than try to update the schema underneath the data kind of on the
Right.
fly. That just doesn't work very well.
Also because it leaves behind so many things that
Yes.
you're not sure if you're
Yeah,
supposed
you
to
can
do
orphan your
not, so.
orphan data. You leave turds all over the place, and so the migrate method is really the best method, and then you can translate those old records into true entities. So it's a lot cleaner. Any more questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank BioRaft for having me and for hosting Drupal Nights. These are great. I want to thank Michelle for badgering me constantly to get me to come here. And I appreciate you listening. Thank you.